Great. Well, welcome back to the Armchair Trader podcast. And this week we're talking about nickel. Nickel being a metal that is in increasingly greater demand, particularly now as we're getting new sources of demand for it. And if you were a manufacturer of electric vehicles sitting in the US, you'd probably have high on your Christmas wish list a large potential resource, maybe just across the border in Canada, that you might be able to get access to in the future. And that's certainly what I thought when I first met FPX Nickel, and specifically Martin Turenne, who's the CEO, who is joining us on the podcast this morning. So welcome, Martin.
Hi, Stuart. Good to chat with you again.
So for those who are not familiar with FPX Nickel, haven't come across it before, can you give us a brief overview of the company and the projects you're looking at?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So FPX is a Canadian company. We're headquartered in Vancouver, British Columbia, so on the west coast of Canada. And it's a fairly straightforward story. We're 100% focused on the development of a pre-feasibility study phase or stage nickel project in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. That project is called Baptiste. So we're moving Baptiste forward to a pre-feasibility study this year. It is one of the world's largest undeveloped nickel deposits, and we think it can be a key strategic resource feeding units to the growing North American electric vehicle battery supply chain by the end of this decade.
And traditionally, what has nickel been used for, other than obviously for batteries, which are obviously the new area where it's being used?
Yeah, so nickel, the principal use of nickel, even to this very day, is for the production of stainless steel. So stainless steel, of course, has many consumer applications in your own home, I'm sure, cutlery, appliances, and the like. Also, of course, widely used in hospitals and in all kinds of industrial application as supporting rebar in things like wharves and bridges for tankage and piping as well. The battery segment of demand is quite a small slice of the pie. 2/3 of nickel demand currently is for stainless steel, and only about 6 to 7% of nickel is used for batteries. But of course, that use of batteries is expected to grow and take an expanding part of that pie. But at the same time, we continue to see and continue to expect very robust stainless steel demand going forward. As the rest of the developing world continues to catch up to Western living standards, the per capita intensity of stainless steel consumption in those developing countries, which is currently quite a bit lower than Western countries, will continue to accelerate. And so stainless steel demand growth is typically, well in excess of global GDP growth. And really the new demand coming from electric vehicles is almost the cherry on top of what was already a very robust, industrial growth story for stainless demand.
So yeah, something that doesn't get spoken about a lot really is the fact that you're going to be seeing more demand for this going forward, even without the battery sector. But the battery sector itself, obviously something that creates a lot of excitement. There's a lot of anticipated demand, particularly as the US vehicle sector starts to shift over more and more into electric vehicles, and that certainly seems something that the Biden administration is interested in. As someone with a potentially massive nickel project just over the border in British Columbia, how important do you see that demand from North American manufacturers for something like this?
Yeah, it's of huge strategic import to the car companies. The transition to electric vehicles will create winners and losers among the incumbent automakers. The winners will be those that secure raw materials, and the losers will be the ones that do not. And I do think the landscape of who's still in business in the auto industry will change dramatically over the next 10 to 15 years, and it will hinge on raw material security of supply. Given the significant role that nickel plays in the battery chemistry, and its principal function is to increase the range of the battery and to ensure fast as possible charging time. So it is critical. That demand for nickel is as we alluded to, expected to grow, but it's of existential import to the automakers. They simply must secure these raw materials. So what that has created for us is a widened landscape of competitive tension around our project. You said there, Stuart, that it's a potentially very large project. It already is well known to be a very large deposit. It's, as I said, one of the 5 largest undeveloped nickel deposits in the world. There are not many of such deposits, of course, in the world, much less in Canada. And so while we've continued to see a lot of interest in our company from large diversified mining companies, over the last 2 years, we've had an increasing intensity of interest from the car makers and the battery makers. And in recent months, we have started to see that those car companies are making upstream investments, whereby they are providing significant capital to junior companies advancing lithium and nickel projects. And the reason those car companies are advancing that capital is to get their hands on future supply via offtake agreements. The most known example of that recently was General Motors investing $650 million into the equity of Lithium Americas, which is advancing a project in Nevada. And I expect that in the years to come, we will see tens of billions of dollars invested by car companies into junior mining companies like FPX. And that will provide, obviously, a significant source of capital for us to ultimately bring this project into fruition.
And this ability to secure raw materials, when I first started looking at this a number of years ago, at the time the only people who were talking about it were actually the miners themselves. Now you're seeing that move on to the more mainstream news agenda. You're seeing people like Joe Biden talking about it. It sounds to me like this is really becoming much more of a hot button issue, both in Washington and further afield. That ability for US manufacturers to get access to those raw materials. And again, I keep coming back to the point, but the fact that you've got that resource right there over the border in Canada, that's got to be a massive plus factor for this company.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, nickel stands at the intersection of these 2 huge trends that are affecting the entire global economy. One is the trend to electrification, and nickel is a fundamental part of that. But 2 is the sort of the geopolitical considerations around this concept of friendshoring or deglobalization, where regional supply chains are having to gain in critical importance. Obviously, the military, the war in Ukraine has created a significant issue for Europe throughout this winter. And so the security of raw materials, of energy materials, oil and gas, but also lithium, nickel, et cetera, that goes into batteries, this is a significant geopolitical issue, and it's causing automakers and governments to want to ensure that they have friendly sources of supply. And that's something that the Biden administration is actually putting into law. And the way they're putting that into law is they're tying the EV subsidies in the United States. So that is up to $7,000 available to buyers of EVs for each vehicle. But in order for those vehicles to be eligible, the raw materials going into those vehicles need to be sourced from free trade allies. And if any amount of those materials is coming via China or Russia, the vehicle is not eligible for the subsidy. So that places critical importance and a strategic, even greater importance on raw materials coming from friendly countries like Canada. Nickel is particularly acutely exposed to this. China and Russia, they have effective control over something in the region of 65% of global nickel production. So if none of those nickel units are permitted into the United States to be eligible for the EV subsidy, that leaves not a lot of nickel from the rest of the world. from places like Canada and Australia that would be suitable sources. And that only highlights the critical importance and the strategic importance of deposits like FPXs, and it really speaks to the high degree of interest we've seen from major car makers in our project.
And speaking specifically about the project, the nickel that you have is called Arorite nickel. What's so special about that? Because that's not just ordinary common and garden nickel, is it?
No, it's not. So this is a unique deposit. Most nickel, all current nickel production, in fact, comes from either sulfide sources from places like Canada and Russia, or from nickel laterites in places like Indonesia and the Philippines. Our nickel is a nickel iron alloy mineral called awaroite, as you mentioned. And while there are many occurrences of awaroite nickel all over the world, we are the first company to have found a deposit where the primary form of nickel in the deposit is as awaroite as opposed to sulfide or laterite. So with that come both great opportunities and challenges. The challenges are really to do mostly with sort of market reception. The mining industry is not noted as particularly innovative, and so bringing a new source of metal supply to the market is sometimes viewed a bit skeptically. But we actually think that the awaroite style of nickel has significant advantages, and we've demonstrated that through our work on the metallurgical flow sheet. So all of the test work that we've done at both the laboratory and the pilot scale, treating many tons of material from our deposit, has shown that the awaroite nickel can be recovered more readily through a simpler, lower cost process, and it produces a much cleaner product. And the reason for that is that this awaroite nickel will only form in a host rock environment that is depleted in sulfur. And therefore, that host rock is also depleted in the nasty elements that are typically associated with sulfide-hosted deposits. These are elements like arsenic, antimony, mercury, selenium. These are effectively absent from our deposit. And so not only can we recover our nickel units more effectively through a simpler, lower cost process, but we can also produce that clean product that can then more easily be integrated into the production of nickel sulfate, which is the key chemical that goes in the batteries. So we've really undergone this transition, I think, from sort of trying to defend or explain awaroite nickel to the market to now really playing offense, so to speak, and really highlighting its advantages, the distinct advantages it has over other types of nickel deposits. And ultimately, we think that this will be viewed as a bit of a hinge point in the history of nickel production. This is a disruptive new source of nickel supply. And, in the coming years, we will be getting very close to being able to be into production and to demonstrate that conclusively.
Some people will be saying yes, but this all sounds great, but are you getting any? Are you getting any proper recognition for the strategic importance of this project? Obviously, we can't talk about some of the discussions you're having with other companies interested in it, but you do have some news which has come out recently about Canadian government funding. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so just recently we've received some funding from the federal government of Canada. This is under the umbrella of their critical minerals strategy, and it's really the first deployment of capital under that strategy was to provide funding to a half dozen companies who applied for that late last year. We understand there were several hundred companies who applied for the funding, and the funding is designed to accelerate test work for the production of battery grade metal products from Canadian sources, and particularly those sources that may be innovative or disruptive, as ours would be. So we underwent, a fairly lengthy process of due diligence. The application that we submitted ran to almost 200 pages of technical data and support letters from other levels of government and local community members. So it's a great validation for us, and I can tell you that we believe it may be the first of significantly more funding opportunities from the federal government going forward here in Canada. And we've also been invited by the U.S. Department of Defense in the United States to apply for funding, as they also have said that they are willing to fund Canadian projects in critical minerals that are at the feasibility study stage, which we will soon be at that stage. And so the provision of non-repayable free money, free grants from government sources in Canada and the United States, will be a key source of funding for us. And what it should tell investors, I think, is that we have far less reliance on the public equity markets in order to fund ourselves going forward. And so the way to kind of get positioned into something like FPX will be to have to buy it in the open market as opposed to doing it through financings. The other thing I would note is late last year, we took on a new corporate strategic investor. This company bought 9.9% of our equity, is now 9.9% cornerstone shareholder. We did not at that time disclose the identity of that party. That's due to their preference for confidentiality at this point. But I can tell you it's a large public company, with a large footprint of international operations, and their investment in us represents a major technical validation and endorsement. And we hope to be in a position at some point this year to reveal their identity. And I can assure you that it would be very well viewed in the market as that endorsement.
And it's fair to say that you were the only Canadian miner of your size to get this funding from the government as well. It's unusual for a company like this to get that level of recognition.
We were the only junior nickel company to get that funding. That's correct. And, that has really, placed us in a good position with the federal government. They now recognize, I think, the importance of this project. And as I said, it may well open doors to further opportunities for us going forward.
And this really represents the start of both Canadian and US government getting more involved in backing miners of these kinds of critical metals and minerals. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like from where you're sitting at the moment in terms of the actual climate for government support and the Canadian critical mineral strategy? Is that creating a new sense of optimism within the space that you're operating in?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, I was recently at the PDAC, which is the largest mining conference that happens in Toronto each year in the early part of March. And critical minerals was the topic. No one, the discussion around gold was virtually non-existent. This really starts because of the Chinese strategy, right? The Chinese asserted their, strategic imperatives in this critical mineral supply chain many years ago. And that's really a function of the sort of the central control, central planning of that economy allows them to coordinate many parts of the supply chain to ensure that they can secure the raw materials and then produce the batteries and the vehicles themselves. And the rest of the world's governments are now playing catch up to that. So in the United States last year, the Inflation Reduction Act by the Biden administration, entailed hundreds of billions of dollars now of support and subsidies for the development of that electric vehicle supply chain in the United States. Canada is going to be tabling a new budget here federally in the coming weeks, and we expect that will include a significant response to the IRA. So, in effect, Western governments are now following sort of China's lead and really not leaving it only to industry to solve for this electrification challenge, because we know that it is an enormous challenge to meet the Paris climate goals. And given the emphasis that governments have placed on meeting those targets, they will spend a significant amount of money to accelerate that transition. And that means that companies like ours in the mining industry will be direct beneficiaries of that.
I know you can't really say much more on this subject, but I just thought I would put you on the spot slightly. You've mentioned already you've got this strategic investor. You can't really talk about them. You've mentioned already that the electric battery sector in the US is getting much more interested in the producers of the metals they're going to be needing. Do you think? Can you say anything more about possible future opportunities or discussions that you think you might be able to have with companies that are interested in these sorts of nickel and cobalt products, then does it really create a whole new opportunity for you there at FPX Nickel?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And this is something that I don't think the market is really fully awakened to. By the market, I mean retail and institutional investors are not paying yet enough attention to this, not nearly enough attention, in my view. A company like FPX, traditionally as a junior mining company with a large project, with a sort of a world scale project, traditionally there would have been maybe a dozen companies, large diversified mining companies, who would have been the potential acquirer of something like this or the potential strategic funder of it. Now, in the year 2023, that remains the case. What we're also seeing is that companies that have not been in base metals are thinking about deploying money into base metals. We've seen, for example, in recent years, companies like Sibanye-Stillwater go from being a precious metals focused producer to now getting into things like nickel and other critical minerals. So you've seen a widening of the number of mining companies that are interested in these projects. That's number one. Number two, you've seen greater sources of supply of funding from the government. And number three, you've started to see deployment of capital into the mining industry by the car companies and the battery companies. So the analogy I would make here is if you were selling a house, and you do your best to fix up the house and make it clean, and you have an open showing, and where maybe in years gone past, 5 or 6 people might have shown up. Now you might have 100 people coming through the door, and they might be competing with themselves to outbid each other for the prize of buying your home. Well, in that analogy, FPX is the home, and our FPX is the homeowner. The Baptiste project is our home, and we're seeing a lot more people coming through the open house, expressing an interest in potentially buying or at least investing in the company.
Can you tell us a bit more about where you are with the actual Baptiste project right now, and what your plans are for it in the course of this year?
Yes, so as I mentioned, the Baptiste project is at the pre-feasibility study phase, and so we have commenced that work, and the PFS will be complete by September. That represents a significant, scaling up of the engineering work vis-a-vis the scoping study that we would have done on the project a couple of years ago. So that work is well underway. The results will be out in September. In advance of that, we'll have continued news flow on, particularly on metallurgical work. One, to confirm the recovery basis that will underpin the economics of the PFS. And secondly, for the production of battery-grade nickel sulfate. So for the first time in the project's history, we'll be able to show that clear path of production of first nickel concentrate and then subsequently nickel sulfate, which is the chemical that goes in the battery. And that first achievement of production of nickel sulfate is expected to be announced in the market within the next 5 to 6 weeks. In fact, that's a major milestone, and that's something of particular importance because we'll be able to share product specifications with battery companies and auto companies, and really show for the first time in the project's history that we will indeed be a producer of that material. There are also a few other things that we're working on of a strategic nature. We continue to see a lot of interest from a lot of other counterparties, and we may potentially have news on that over the coming months. But yeah, the main focus is really the production of that preliminary feasibility study, which sets the stage for us to potentially enter the permitting process for the project in 2024.
Well, that's brilliant. We'll obviously be keeping a very close eye on developments at the company and keeping our readers up to date on that, and hopefully get you back on the podcast soon with further updates from FPX Nickel.
Yeah, absolutely. It is going to be a busy year, and yeah, it would be great to get back on after we've had some of those news flow accomplishments, whether they're ones that we have definitive line of sight to right now or ones that may be sort of happy surprises, let's say, to the market.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning, Martin. That's brilliant.
Thank you, Stuart.
You've been listening to the Armchair Trader podcast. Make sure you visit our website, www.thearmchairtrader.com, for your daily dose of financial markets news and sign up to our free newsletter there.